you for settling down. All right, we're going to start with our afternoon program. And we're going to start with Justina Avila-Reiger, who is a postdoctoral research scientist at Columbia University. I got an email probably about 5 years ago.
Oh, it's 2016.
2016, from a very eager graduate student who was at University of New Mexico in Albuquerque, who wanted to use data that I had access to, the YCAP study, for her dissertation. And I humored this person and said I would meet them at INS just to talk over their ideas. And it was Justina. And we sat there in the middle of this International Neuropsychological Society meeting, people buzzing around, you know, totally busy, very social, but I couldn't believe it. This person had amazing ideas and was so skilled at, analysis, structural equation modeling, and had wonderful ideas. And so it is just one of the most, wonderful things for me in my career to be counted among the mentors of Justina. And super proud for me to be introducing Justina, giving this talk today. So take it away.
Thank you. Hello, wow, what an introduction. I didn't know I was getting that. Okay, so let's get started. I know that it's right after lunch, so I'm probably gonna have to burp halfway through this, but just try your best to stay awake. I don't know. All right. Let's see here. Okay, so before we get started, I'm going to be using the term sex/gender throughout this presentation, and here's why. Sex and gender are two separate yet interdependent categories that should be distinguished between in our research. However, this has been really difficult for us to do in our research and in human research in general. Definitions of sex and gender have evolved over time within scientific fields, and researchers are finally recognizing that these constructs are much more complex than the binary definitions that we typically assign to them. Not only that, but how people identify can change throughout the life course, and aspects of what researchers consider sex can be modified at any point in a person's life. When it comes to measuring these constructs, most of the cognitive aging studies that we use today only ask participants whether they're male or female. It's unclear whether participants are reporting their sex assigned at birth, chromosomal sex, or their current sex. Since these studies don't also ask about gender, it's unclear whether participants actually reported their sex or their gender. And some of the studies that do actually ask about gender typically do at only one point in time. So that assumes that one's gender identity is fixed over time. So we still have a lot of work to do to accurately define and distinguish between sex and gender. So in the meantime, I prefer to use the term sex/gender to avoid inaccurate use of either term. All right, so today I'm here to talk about intersectionality and multi-level analysis of individual heterogeneity and discriminatory accuracy, MAIHDA, from here on out. I'll spend the first half of the talk going over intersectionality and its use, and then spend the second half going over MAIHDA. I don't know if that's the right way to say it. We have a lot of disagreements about how to say it, but I'm going to say MAIHDA. All right, so intersectionality is an analytic approach to understanding how multiple dimensions of social inequality influence health outcomes across and within social groups. It's been increasingly used in public health to identify heterogeneity in the social patterning of health inequalities. Unfortunately, it hasn't gotten a lot of traction in cognitive aging research yet, but hopefully today I can convince you that it's an important approach. So intersectionality is rooted in Black feminist activism and scholarship, and understanding its history and evolution is extremely important if you're going to use this approach. These are just some of the many Black women who have contributed to intersectionality. Really, the core concepts that are associated with this approach emerge from a much larger historical narrative about race and gender that dates back to the 18th and 19th centuries. Geez, these slides are really moving slow. So anti-racist and feminist movements in the United States have always relied on this single axis framework that views race and sex gender as separate entities. So one movement focuses on racial discrimination, the other movement focuses on sex gender discrimination. And that works for white women who don't experience racism or Black men who don't experience sexism, but it doesn't work for Black women whose lives are simultaneously shaped by both sexism and racism. Racism and sexism can't be disentangled for Black women. You can't simply add what you know about being Black to what you know about being white and then describe the experiences of Black women. And as a result, issues that are specific to Black women often remain unaddressed and ignored within these racial only or gender only movements. So there's a really long history of Black women working to catalog and organize against these interlocking systems of oppression. From Maria Stewart to Audre Lorde, we couldn't be told more explicitly that single focus lenses on social inequality left very little space to address the complex social problems that Black women face and continue to face. So in 1989, Kimberly Crenshaw comes along and actually gave the operation of these overlapping systems of oppression the name intersectionality in her seminal paper here. And she describes the discrimination of Black women that they face with a metaphor of a road intersection. So racial discrimination was on one road, gender discrimination on the other road, and the experiences of Black women were at the center of where these roads cross. So hence the name intersectionality. Shortly after Crenshaw, intersectionality was brought to academia by Black, Latina, and other women of color feminist scholars, and it became a concept, a term, and then a field of study. So since then, let me grab my Gatorade, trying to stay hydrated. Jen told me to take my time, so here I am. Okay. So since then, since Crenshaw and since it's come to academia, intersectionality has really expanded to other academic disciplines, other intersectional oppressions, and it's been suggested as a promising way to advance health inequalities research because it's well suited to address and elucidate how diverse inequalities are driven by multifaceted power structures and processes. And if you think about it, most public health research follows a single axis framework. We tend to look at one disparity at a time in an additive approach, and this really distorts our understanding of these inequalities. So some of the work that we've been doing using an intersectionality approach is focused on looking at variability in women's episodic memory advantage over men. This is an advantage that's assumed to be universal to all women across the life course. But when we looked at interactions between sex, gender, and race and ethnicity, we found that only white women had this advantage over all men. The advantage for Black women and Latinx women either wasn't there or was relative to men of their same race. We have also found that this advantage varies by race and time. So you can see here for whites, the memory advantage for women remain generally consistent across early and late birth cohorts. But for Black individuals, the advantage for women increased in the later birth cohort. And that's because performance for Black men didn't improve over time. And when we looked into this a little further, we found that it was due to Black women having more educational and occupational opportunities in later birth cohorts, while Black men did not see as much of an increase in these opportunities. And this was really specific to our sample in this context. So I use this work as an example to show that when we make single axis generalizations about something like women's memory advantage, we're really obscuring this complex and rich heterogeneity within women. using an intersectionality approach and embracing and examining the heterogeneity that we're seeing here has the potential to lead to a more nuanced understanding of cognitive aging inequalities. Okay, so that was the background. Let's talk about how we can apply an intersectionality approach. So intersectionality as a framework is much more than multiple identities or making comparisons across multiple social groups. There's 4 core tenets that should guide all work that's considered intersectionality. So the first is that racism, sexism, classism, and other similar oppressions are interdependent and mutually construct one another. You can't understand the effect of one without the intersection of the others. These intersecting power relations shape individuals' social identities, positions, and their lived experiences. And as a result, they also produce complex, interdependent social inequalities of race, sex, gender, class, sexual orientation, et cetera, et cetera. Those are like those social identities and positions that we see these disparities in. And then finally, advancing equity is really the ultimate goal of all intersectionality research. It should be. That's part of the 4 core tenets. So some will argue that qualitative approaches are ideal for intersectionality research because they're able to explore the complexities of lived experiences in a more nuanced way than quantitative approaches. And I don't entirely disagree with that. Lisa Bullig has an excellent paper where she discusses both approaches. I won't get into the weeds now, but both quantitative and qualitative methods have their strengths and weaknesses when it comes to intersectionality research. And the critiques of quantitative intersectionality research are definitely warranted. Much of this work only focuses on differences across multiple social identities and positions. They often don't interpret findings in the context of social inequality, nor have they incorporated measures of overlapping structural processes. So there definitely is a need for a comprehensive quantitative approach that addresses all aspects of intersectionality. But I'd like to argue, as Bullig does in this article, that the issues aren't necessarily within the quantitative approaches themselves, but rather the philosophical stance of the researchers that are using them. And if we do it right, quantitative methods have a lot to offer in contributing to our understanding of how intersecting social inequalities shape population health patterns. So the goal of most quantitative research in this area, and I say most because there are a lot of different quantitative approaches to looking at intersectionality, but the most popular and the most frequently used approach is to examine heterogeneity in health outcomes across different intersectional subgroups of people. And this is typically referred to as intercategorical intersectional analysis. And these intersectional subgroups that they're talking about are based on combinations of social identities and positions of interest. So if you're interested in SES, race, and sex gender, your intersectional subgroups might be something like high SES, Black women, low SES, white men, etc. And in this work, researchers tend to view these social identities as proxies for lived experience or as proxies for overlapping oppressions. I'm not endorsing or disagreeing with that. I'm just telling you that's what they do. So analyses in using this approach typically involve 2 steps. The first is to map out health inequalities across these intersectional subgroups and identify those who are at highest risk. And then the second is to determine whether the patterning of these inequalities have additive or have multiplicative effects. And so this is a really important, this additive versus multiplicative effects is really important with this approach to intersectionality research. So keep that in mind and pay attention to these next parts. So effects are additive if they layer on top of each other. So adding the effect of being Black to the effect of being a woman to describe the cognitive health of a Black woman. And the assumption here is that the effect of being Black on cognitive health is the same regardless of one's sex gender. Now, when intersectional outcomes are different than expected, given the referent attributes that comprise them, the effects are multiplicative. They have amplifying or attenuating effects. All right, you guys got that? Okay, cool. So the most popular analytic technique for categorical intersectional analysis is the traditional fixed effects model. So you have main effects for each social dimension that you're interested in, and then an interaction term between them. So if an interaction is present, then that's considered evidence of multiplicative effects. Something is, there you go. All right, well, so there are a few limitations with this model that make intersectional analyses challenging. Typically, we're interested in more than two categories and dimensions. Like we might want to look at other racial or ethnic groups and different aspects of SES, for example. So our basically our equation might look a little bit like this, and that's not even the full equation. So it really is just not that feasible to specify all of these higher order interactions due to issues with scalability, model parsimony, reduced sample size in some groups, and then just overall interpretability when we have a bunch of different dimensions that we want to see if they interact or not. Also, this model gives us interaction effect. This specific model gives us an interaction effect only for Black women. And ideally, we want to be able to determine simultaneously whether all intersectional subgroups exhibit evidence of an interaction. And there are also aspects of this model that don't necessarily align with intersectional thinking, like the fact that we have to interpret our findings as a deviation from some reference group, and in this case, white men. And then also interpreting disaggregated main effects has a tendency to take us back to single axis thinking. Now, this is where MAIHDA comes in, not as a substitute to the fixed effects model, but as a promising approach that has many technical and conceptual advantages compared to the fixed effects model. And as you can see in its name, it uses multi-level modeling. So in traditional multi-level modeling, individuals are typically clustered at some higher level by some observable context, like a neighborhood or a school. And this is done because individuals in that neighborhood or that school share something that creates similarity between them. And ignoring this clustering would violate assumptions of independence. Now, with MAIHDA, rather than something concrete like neighborhoods, individuals are nested within intersectional subgroups. And the rationale is that individuals sharing the same intersectional subgroup have a similar context that's shaped by overlapping systems of oppression and privilege. So rather than a concrete geographical boundary that a neighborhood, that's how you select different neighborhoods, it's the intersectional subgroups. It's an abstract boundary, and it's defined by what we're hypothesizing that these people are experiencing similar overlapping systems of oppression. So we're essentially saying using these intersectional subgroups as a context. Now, unlike the fixed effects model, MAIHDA is able to handle a large number of interactions in intersectional subgroups, as well as subgroups with smaller sample sizes. And this is because of the statistical shrinkage that's inherent in these multi-level models, which causes estimates from smaller, more unreliable intersections to be shrunk closer to the grand mean. And this shrinkage also partly corrects for the issue of multiple testing. Now, there are other things we can talk about with this shrinkage where it may not work out as expected, but that's for another time. We're also able to obtain interaction estimates for each intersectional subgroup. That was something that we really wanted on our wish list. So this modeling approach gives us that, which is really awesome. And aspects of MAIHDA also more closely aligned with intersectional theory. There's no reference group. And since interactions are treated as context rather than individual characteristics, the temptation to revert back to single axis thinking is somewhat removed with this modeling approach. All right, so let's get into the steps of how we do this. So this approach involves estimating two multi-level models, a null model that's going to provide us with a detailed mapping of inequalities across subgroups, and then an interaction model that determines whether the patterning of these inequalities in the null model are additive or have multiplicative effects. So the setup for the null model is only an intercept and a random effect for the intersectional subgroups with no covariates. Sometimes you can have covariates on a single level. So if you want to add age in to adjust for age, you could have something on the individual level, but no covariates on the group level. And then you also get between and within variance estimates. And we use this to calculate the variance partition coefficient, VPC. It's the same thing as an ICC that you would calculate in a multi-level model. And this just allows us to estimate the extent that the variance in an outcome is explained by differences across intersections versus differences within them.
So sorry. Is that really mu is the residual, or did you mean E sub O J is the group level residual?
So the mu is the group level residual. The E, that's the individual residual.
From the group.
Yeah. Yep.
So it's a group level residual from or difference from average. Right?
Yeah. Yep. All right. Okay. So now this is the interaction model. Now, what we're going to do in the interaction model is include additive parameters based on the variables used to create our intersectional subgroups. So if I have 4 subgroups based on sex, gender, and race, then I'm adding a dummy variable for sex, gender, and a dummy variable for race into my model. And importantly, there are no interaction terms specified in this model. You're just adding these main effects. All right, so stick with me here because this is the important part. So if there are no multiplicative effects and the patterning of the inequalities that we just saw are just additive, then the main effects of the variables used to construct the subgroup would completely explain the between group variance. So it's going to be 0. And all 4 intersectional subgroup random effects would also equal 0. So if what we're finding is only due to additive effects and not those multiplicative effects, this is what we're going to see in the interaction model. Now, if this is not the case, and if no relevant variables were omitted, then the between group variance will be greater than 0 and would illustrate the existence of a multiplicative interaction effect. This is really slow. And the group level residuals are now going to be the specific interaction terms for each subgroup. And they represent the difference between what is observed for a particular subgroup and what might be expected for it based on additive contributions. So I'm going to show you an example with real data. So hopefully it'll all make sense. So this is data from a nationally representative sample where the social dimensions are sex, gender, what? Yeah. Yeah.
So wait, you got everything in the
Oh.
question in the mic. Yeah.
So you're saying that it will equal the group level variance, or are you talking about residual variance?
Yes, from you.
Yeah, the group level residual will equal 0 if there's no interaction, assuming that we specified all of the groups correctly.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, that is the biggest question. We're making a big assumption that there's no omitted variables and that we've specified these groups well. And so the first part with the VPC, that is kind of a cool piece of this null model, because in a sense, it's supposed to be like establishing the validity of these groups, but still, there's still a lot that we aren't sure about, and we're making these big assumptions. Yeah. Anyone else? I'm going. All right. So, all right, real data, dimensions are sex, gender, race, SES that I categorize into low, medium, and high. So this is going to give us 12 intersectional subgroups. So individuals will be nested in one of these 12 intersectional subgroups. Now, here's our detailed mapping of inequalities from the null model. These are baseline memory scores adjusted for age. So 0 represents expected memory performance for the given age. Black women with low SES have the lowest memory scores, followed by Black men with low and medium SES and white men with low SES. And then white women are performing above age expectations regardless of their SES, but white women with high SES do have the highest score reliably here. And then these are our variance estimates for our null model. And again, we want to calculate the VPC for this model to determine whether the group differences that I just showed you are meaningful, or if group differences are obscuring individual variability within and between groups. So 18.2 is considered moderate. It is barely there, but it does indicate that there is meaningful variation between intersectional subgroups. So they could be considered a valid social constructs for understanding inequalities in our outcome. Yeah.
Can I ask 2 questions?
Yeah.
What are the rubric for what's the rubric for considering small, medium, large? And you got a confidence interval on the VPC. Where did that come from? Does it come from the software?
Yeah. Oh, sorry. So how do I determine low, medium, and high? This is from I can send the article that I found, but it's not like a golden rule. It's just kind of like what if somebody put some flags in the stand? Yeah. And then the confidence intervals, yes, that I can calculate that with M+. Cool. This is our interaction model. And then just a reminder, this is the deal. So our model, our variance in this model is 0.021. So there is evidence of multiplicative effects, which means that there is an overall interaction effect. We can also determine how much of the between group variation is due to additive versus multiplicative effects by dividing the variance from this model by the variance in the null model. And so about 89% of between group variation was due to additive effects, but 11% due to multiplicative effects. All right, now these are group level residuals from the interaction model that represent the unique interaction effects for each subgroup. So again, we're making an assumption that there are no omitted variables here. And so basically the residual represents the difference between what is observed for a particular subgroup and what might be expected based on the additive contribution. So an interaction will be present if a subgroup has an outcome that breaks with the overall pattern of the additive main effects. The residual is below 0, the observed, or is above 0, the observed performance was higher than expected, given main effects. If it's below 0, then observed performance is lower than expected, given main effects. So we found 6 specific interactions here. So for Black women with low SES, their memory scores were even lower than expected, suggesting that maybe classism interacts with racism and sexism in a way that the negative effects of having low SES are amplified for Black women. And at the same time, it seems like Black women with high SES have higher scores than expected, suggesting that their memory may disproportionately benefit from having higher SES. It also seems like for Black men, these overlapping oppressions may interact in such a way that they don't benefit as much as would be expected from having higher SES. And then what's going on over here with this interaction may indicate is that having low SES doesn't have as much of a negative impact on white women's memory performance. Now, I think that these specific interaction effects are one of the coolest parts of the model, because it's so they're so nuanced. They provide a really nuanced understanding of these subgroup inequalities. But there are some caveats that I want to bring up quickly. How am I looking on time, Jen?
About 5 more minutes.
All right, cool. So basically, the interpretation of MAIHDA interaction effects are going to be different from how we would interpret an interaction effect in a fixed effect model. Basically, the additive contributions and the interaction part for both models are similar, but the biggest difference is that for the fixed effects model, basically, the main effects, what they're calculating for the effect of Black, what you're calculating is the average difference between Black men and white men. And then the interaction for this specific setup is really going to be for Black women. It's going to be dependent on expected values for other groups. While for MAIHDA, the interpretation of the main effect or the effect of being Black on whatever the outcome is different. It's the average difference between Black and white respondents across their gender. So it has Black women and men. So when you're interpreting the interaction, you're explaining how they're deviating from average values that already take into account Black women. So quickly, strengths and weaknesses, and I'm gonna wrap up. This is really slow. All right. So major strength of this model is that it doesn't get more geometrically complicated when you add in more dimensions. And that's because when you add in more dimensions, you're only adding in main effects. And there we go. Yeah, so you only have to add in enough main effect parameters for each dimension that you're adding to the model. So that is, Jesus. Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, so I mean, Maria's going to disagree with me on this one maybe, but I think that I've seen some papers that have like 384 intersectional subgroups. I think that's a bit overboard and sort of gets away from the point of intersectionality. I think that it ends up turning into an everyone is different thing, and then commonalities between people are really just lost. It's just a lot, and I don't understand how you can incorporate meaning or interpret meaning from a lot of these, but I'm open for disagreement. So even though most of this work is cross-sectional, multi-level modeling has a lot of flexibility to do things that we're familiar with. So we could look at longitudinal MAIHDA. If you're interested in cognitive trajectories, you would just have to estimate a 3-level model. Now you just have, instead of one outcome, you can have 2 or maybe even 3 outcomes. And so the modeling approach is exactly the same. And then you can also do time to dementia as an option. There's a few limitations when it comes to estimating some of the variance components, still a work in progress, but option nonetheless. And then the downside is that we don't have any guidance for best practices. I already talked about this, and at the end of the slide deck, I also have other resources about MAIHDA compared to the fixed effects approach. So while I think that viewing intersectional subgroups as social contexts in this model is a strength, I've yet to see people interpret their findings within a macro social socio-historical context. So I think that's really what we need to do with MAIHDA is incorporate context and also measures of structural inequality. And I think that it sets things up really well to do this and to add these dimensions into our models as interactions. And that is.
Go ahead and do your summary.
All right, well, okay. So intersectionality, without a doubt, complicates everything. But it also has the potential to provide a more nuanced, complex, complete understanding of cognitive aging inequalities. If you're going to use it, don't ignore its Black feminist roots. There's a lot of work to be done with in quantitative methods to fully incorporate the core ideas of intersectionality. MAIHDA is a new and promising approach that could help us get there. There's a lot of uncharted territory to explore, especially when it comes to longitudinal modeling, and then also incorporating context and measures of structural inequality. And that's it.
Come on up and get in line for questions. I did not see any on the Zoom chat yet. That was wonderful, Justina. You already got a couple questions from the audience.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
People from at big conferences know that I love to ask a question. One thing, I went back and I looked at the Crenshaw article, and I just think it's such a deep article. And one thing it's doing is talking about the particularity of the experience of people at the intersections. But I think there's another metaphor, and I couldn't find it. You talked about the crossing road metaphor, but I think she has this other metaphor about kind of looking up through a prism, and I need to go back and find it. But she has this idea that there's the particularity, but then in the legal framework she was critiquing, it also like pits the particularity against the idea that, you know, patriarchy plays out differently for Black women and white women, and that just because it looks different doesn't mean it's not still patriarchy. That a lot of the frameworks emphasizing the particularity are also trying to downplay like the connections and the bonds, that there is this common thing about patriarchy, even though it plays out very differently. Like she talked about Black women's higher labor force participation, and it can look like, oh, there's no problem there because we're defining patriarchy and employment against white women's exclusion. And I don't know if this gets at that, like getting at the particularity, but also kind of being able to kind of quantify kind of the lens to show that there is this common concept, even though it plays out differently.
Yeah, that's, well, I mean, I think you said it all there. I agree. And I think that getting into looking at some of those measures of like structural racism and also structural sexism, that example is about labor force participation is a really good example of that. And I think that what it's going to take, kind of creating a new set of ways to look at these in a way that isn't centered in what we know about like white women. Yeah. So thank you for that. And I agree. I don't think MAIHDA gets it. Yeah.
Thank you. This is great. I was hoping you could touch a little bit more on what you were discussing at the end about interpretation. In particular, when you have so many interactions, it seems like MAIHDA has this great sort of power advantage over including like 17 interaction terms and 3- and 4-way and things like that. But something I always struggle with when thinking about interactions is I like to have a hypothesis about the expected direction. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how that plays into MAIHDA, maybe in the context of your example where you showed particular groups were more disadvantaged than maybe you would have expected, sort of how you hypothesize and then interpret when you have, even with 12, it seemed like a bit of a challenge, let alone like 48 or 384, or things like that.
Yeah, I think that is the challenge with looking at so many different interactions. I think that and I think that that's how this approach can get away from intersectionality, because really at the core of intersectionality is interpreting these differences within this like this historical social context, and that's hard to do when you have all of those different interactions to interpret. So I don't have an answer right now, but hopefully in this conference we can talk about that and think about how to best approach that. I do think that adding like more context into our models could be helpful.
Because I have such a reputation. Jen like doesn't trust me to say, Justina, that was an awesome talk. Like, it's so good. It is a joy to hear you talk.
Did she tell you to be nice?
Yeah, she's over there whispering at me. It was really wonderful. And I think the method is just super cool. And I feel like I don't know the boundaries here of what's going to be useful. I have a couple questions.
Yeah.
One is building on this power thing. I have 3 questions. One is this building on this power thing. Like, I feel like small sample sizes within intersectional identities would lead the BLUPs to be closer to the null, but it wouldn't necessarily mess up the variance ratio calculation. And so the variance ratio seems maybe more informative if you have a whole bunch of identities. So is that, do you agree with me on that?
Yes, I do.
Okay,
I do.
great.
I do. And like, and you can,
Here, you can come.
see, yeah, no, I do. And I think that there are simulations that show that with the more intersections you have, the better the estimate's going to be for the variance.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. My next question is, one is random slopes, and maybe that's what you do with the longitudinal width is you do random slopes. Are people using random slopes? And that you just did random intercepts, but are people using random slopes? And then my next question was multiplicative models, like logit, survival, like these are multiplicative. So do we do this or do we stop?
Yeah. So that is one of the so what I was talking about is like with these multi-level models, we do have a lot of flexibility, but there's no guidelines to be able to do those. Like, I don't know what I just decided to try to do it a while ago, but I don't know, like, am I breaking some mathematical law? I'm not sure, but we can do it. But yeah, I think that there's a lot of things to think about. Like, no one has done the random slopes yet, but technically you can. But yeah, I don't know.
Any other questions from the room? So I just want to say something, Justina. Not yet, but just in case. I was just going to say that in terms of Eleanor's question about hypotheses, I think it's a really good one. It's something I struggle with every single time I'm writing a paper or a grant, which is that there are some groups that we don't have enough information to have a hypothesis about. And I think it should be okay for us to say that. And it's hard because then you get feedback from reviewer number 2, who's like, you didn't have a hypothesis about this group. So then you have to have a whole dialogue with them about that. But I do think that there are some groups and there is some research that will allow us to have, some hypotheses about some groups. And we should do that before engaging in this type of, broad, comparison across these groups. And if you don't have any hypotheses, then I guess, why are you doing this work? So that was my only comment there.
Yeah, well, if you read a lot of like the MAIHDA papers, they'll say this is exploratory. Like, we don't have. Some of them will say like they don't have hypotheses because they're just way too many to make. And I think that yeah, why are you doing it? It's a little weird. Yeah. Anyway.
Go ahead, Rich.
First of all, excellent talk. Thank you for explaining that to me in a way I really understand it. One thing I really like about the approach is focusing on that variance component and getting away from the directionality of the multiplicative interaction terms in the fixed effect model. Because in my experience, what I think you will encounter a lot is when you do the fixed effect multiplicative interaction term, you'll find things that don't make sense or are disappointing. Like people who have 2 of these risk factors, they seem to be, the effects are attenuated. And it's hard to get your head wrapped around, but it's probably only because there's only so many ways people can, get down. And if these disparity factors are working via similar pathways, when you put them together in a model, they'll work counter to each other. But if you just conform your hypotheses in terms of there will be evidence for multiplicative interaction, that's a pretty simple thing to test, and you've already got a confidence interval, so we can start to do our power calculations around that. Anyway, thank you.
I didn't know that.
All right, Justina.
Cool.
Good job. Awesome. That was great. Thank you so much, everybody. We are now on to our 10-minute break. When we come back, we're going to learn about the data sets that we're going to be using during our work